Hello, and welcome to another artistic adventure. Today I'm going to show you how I painted and animated this model. This is my last video on this series of models, as it's the last car that I haven't painted yet. For those of you confused, half the models haven't been recorded or painted as I was still figuring out what I was doing back then. As for most of these, you can find them on my channel. As always, we just need to begin by blocking out the model. I originally wanted to go with orange because I thought it looked nice with the red, but it ended up looking a bit too similar, so you'll see me change it later on. I do quite like how the red and grey play off each other, so I'll strive to continue this colour pairing throughout the rest of the model. I still needed another colour, so I tried various things, but what I liked the most was the blue, because it went so well with the orange. Sadly, however, the orange supremacy was not meant to be, as through a quick RGB stroke, I discovered that the yellow just looked a bit better with the color scheme I had going on. It wasn't quite as similar as the red, but it still had the warm tones that I was looking for. With our main colors picked out, now we just need to go and separate all the sections apart from each other. We want to follow the geometry so that the eye gets guided along all the nice detail that we've sculpted into this model. This is done by just following the separation on any of the armor panels or any other pinched section of the model. We'll then turn it into a complementary color and make it look like it's meant to be there. This will help make the model look a lot less monochrome and be a lot more visually interesting. For reasons that'll become a bit obvious later on, we want to separate these headlights and give them their own material properties. This is going to help us just add that degree of separation and also allows us to add a UV map for each individual headlight so that we aren't working on a really small canvas. You may have noticed that our formerly blue parts are now black. I've changed it because it looks a bit better with the new yellow as opposed to the old orange. But don't you worry, we're going to highlight this black with a lot of blue, ensuring that we keep its color and avoid making it look dull. Next, we want to add some highlights to the model in the form of glowing parts. It'll make the model look a bit more dynamic and also add a bit of visual flair because we're going for a science fiction-y feel. We can also use these glowy parts to add the suggestion of function to the model. For instance, I'm adding glow parts to the indents of this part of the wing to show some internal glowy power source of some kind. It's my intention to use this to suggest it's using it as propulsion. Now we just need to add glow to the last thing for now, that being this part here. Unfortunately, that's a lie because it's not actually the right part, it was the thing on top of it. So I have wasted a little bit of time here glowing up the wrong thing. Lastly, we just need to go around, double check and make sure we've got everything. In this case, I just need to make this part of the tail metal and mosey on over to the wing to do the same there. This is where the fun begins. As you can see, the headlights are giving us some trouble. This is why they needed their own material that I mentioned earlier, as they're essentially trying to use the same texture but on a different mesh, so it gets all stretched and isn't supposed to go where it's going. Once we've got our correct yellow, we're going to make it darker and lay it on down so that when we paint over it, it'll act like these shadows. Our aim here is to create a pseudo shadow that'll always be there, regardless of how much light is on the model. We just want to continue this process using lighter and lighter yellows and highlighting up to a lighter and lighter point. At the end, we should have a nice little gradient that'll look quite spiffy. For those of you curious, this is what the headlights look like if you hadn't fixed them up until now. The solution is simple. All you have to do is make your own texture and bind it to that specifically, so that it's separate from the main body. Now all you have to do is, during the editing process, realize that you have in fact created a minion, and in order to escape the horror, move on to the next section as quickly as possible. What we have to do now is paint these wings yellow. Unfortunately, they don't seem to want to take paint very well and do funny things like this whenever I try. I got around this by having a top view and painting straight down onto them. Thankfully this worked because it's a relatively flat piece of the model. With all that in mind, painting it is relatively simple. All we have to do is start darker and highlight up to a light point as we've already done before to get that nice gradient. Moving on to the middle hull, I've got a little bit of cleanup to do because I've been a bit sloppy in selecting the areas that I want to designate. Quick fix later and we are back to the painting, which is mostly the same as before, starting dark and going progressively lighter until eventually you get to the brightest highlight. We have to keep in mind that this is a round model, and light's going to play weird tricks on its surface. In an effort to simulate this, I'm going to carve organic looking shapes in the painting of this model. While I'm not sure if it succeeded, I do like how it looks. We just need to repeat all those steps over again on the back hull, and then we get to the tail, which is also quite interesting because it has a bit of a sharper edge profile, which means our highlights can really pop here. We move on to one of the more focal points of this model, the red. This is the cockpit, so it'll be a red glass type of feel. So we'll need to layer on a lot of hues that are close to each other in color for a more subtle gradient. In order to get a better view while I was painting, I switched to a different view setting in my properties menu. This meant that everything without a texture appeared white, and I really liked this look. I kept this in mind going forward. I just kept layering it on, going more and more, while leaving less and less of that old color exposed underneath, highlighting up to a tip. By the end, it looks like it's glowing internally. The last ingredient in our cockpit making recipe is to make it nice and shiny, so it actually does look like glass. Given how much I really like the white, I tried to achieve this by making the metal parts white as well. It was sort of a middle ground, because all the black parts needed to be darker. They looked a bit silly as white. Therefore, the middle solution was the way to go. At this point, I realized I forgot to paint this yellow part here, so I quickly did that before moving on. Next, we'll focus on painting all the metal parts. We want to do essentially the same thing, making a very dark back base coat and then highlighting up to a lighter coat. The difference here is with our material properties. We're going to make them a lot shinier than the yellow. We press on by continuing to paint the back hull, also silver. However, I ran into a bit of confusion here. No matter what I did, the paint wouldn't paint. Apparently the issue is I had forgotten to put a texture node on this material, and once I had, everything worked fine. We then follow the same process as we had with the tail, just keeping in mind that we've got an extra piece of geometry jutting out the top. So we just leave the recess of the connection there as the original color, just to give us more shadow. It is at this point that the first signs that I'd made the wrong decision had come to light, but I wanted to stick with the process. In hindsight, I had made these too bright, and if I had to do it over again, I maybe wouldn't have used so many hues and definitely would have made it a bit darker. But onwards we push. I'm going onto the middle hull now, and I just need to pay attention carefully to the geometry as there's a big slab of something in the middle, so it's not just a big flat surface like the previous one. No matter, I simply highlight around it, make it look nice and shiny. Pressing on with our metal spree, we arrive at the big one, the front hull. Despite its size and girth, it's mostly the same as before. We follow the geometry and carefully highlight up. During this process, I found that I had actually missed a spot, but that's easy enough to solve. We just go back into the shader editor and assign it the correct material. I was highlighting the rim here, where the pipe goes into the hull, where I found that I actually did some overspray. So I cleaned it up, and also found it quite satisfying. I'll just let the clip play, so you can enjoy it with me. Finally, I also touched up the rims around the minion, around the base and the eye. I continued having strange painting problems on the little wing arm here, just as before. I again worked around it, but it was starting to get irritating. However, I simply needed to highlight the edges and not much more. These little ball joints were the next thing in my sights. Originally, I started with a darker highlight, but I soon changed to a lighter one because I realized that because it's a round surface, most of the object will be catching light anyway, so I needed to highlight with a darker color. I ended up putting it the wrong place, however, at least I think so. If I had to do it again, I'd put the darker part facing the joint area and not outwards. Going on to our final metal part, we're going to do the gun barrels. Much like the ball joint, we're going to start with a very light highlight, and then simply fill in the dark areas. This is because it has a lot of sharp angles and other areas that we need to highlight that would be very difficult to get into, so it's easier to do it in reverse. Here is some further evidence of me not quite liking the color scheme. I experiment around a bit, but ultimately returned to what I already had, as I thought it fit the best. Even so, something about the color scheme still irked me. This is where the red saga begins. As I'm painting the cylinder, I mistakenly don't make an extra texture for the metal bit, so there's a lot of overspray and I have to redo it. After that though, I use a lot of the same color scheme as I did with the cockpit, make it look nice and smooth. I was about to start painting these wing flaps red, when I noticed that I'd made an interesting mistake. As you can see, the highlights here don't really make sense, so all I had to do was just go back and tidy that up. This is where I actually started painting these little flap things, when something didn't quite go according to plan. Every time I tried to paint the thing, it would always end up going sort of behind it, so I was painting on the opposite end of what I was actually doing. It turns out, for whatever reason, the normals on all the wing parts, including the flaps, were flipped in the wrong direction. All I had to do was flip them back manually. No idea why this was, but simple fix, and now everything's fine. We can now, for real this time, actually start painting these things. For the most part, it's the same as we've done before with the previous red, with the addendum of I tried to add a bit of texture to the bottom of the flaps, maybe like some flames or maybe some wear on the bottom of the flaps, but I'm not confident enough in my texture painting, so I just decided to go for the standard paint job. For those curious, yes, I did paint each of these panels individually. Aside from that, each panel avoided having its recesses shade towards the bottom of the panel. This was done in effort to make it look like the panel had actually experienced some wear. That's looking great. Just in time for us to go and do it all over again because of these little flap things here. These are slightly different, as they're going to be holding all the bombs that this thing's going to release. I'm envisioning all these flaps opening at once and releasing a full payload, and then decimating whatever lies below. And to reiterate this point, all of these objects were of different geometry, so I could not use the same texture. I had to paint every single one individually, all in the name of looking good. But the star of the show of all that effort is this bomb right here. It's almost like the final boss of this painting process, as it involves most of the colors and techniques that we've used thus far. And as it is right now, it needs some adjustment. For instance, the blue's just a placeholder color that I seek to change. We begin the battle by highlighting all these spiky bits. There are quite a lot of them, so it's a bit of a battle of attrition. Unfortunately, we aren't going to be able to add a second hue to any of these because there are just too many of them and it's too difficult to apply. Don't worry about the overspray, as there's a reason we're doing these spikes first. Stage 2 is the red. We're just going to weave in between the spikes with our lighter hues until eventually we've gone throughout the maze-like pattern and made these little recessed places. We are going up to 3 hues with this one though, so buckle up. It's the end of our bomb painting, but the start of our glow bits. We start by doing the reverse highlight of what we've already been doing, by having it brighten the corners and highlighting up to a darker and darker spot. This is going to make it look like there's power emanating from within. Following our victory over the boss battle, what we have next is small fry. Starting with the gun barrels, we essentially do the same thing as we've just done. Next, we've got the little minion eyes, which we want to actually highlight in the traditional style because they're more of a light than a glow, so we want them to look a bit different. We also do the glow pots and the pipes, which admittedly took a while because of how many there are, but one way or another, it got done. Next, we do the little bomb chassis thing here, which is thankfully a quick and painless affair. After that, we highlight the little wing arm, so it makes it look like the wing is suspended, even though there isn't any physical connection holding them together. Capping out the glow bits, we're just going to highlight these little port things here, where the energy is going to come out and propel the thing forward. And before you ask, yes, each of them was done individually. On to something that's a bit more subtle, we're going to do some of the black bits. I say black, but we're really looking for a very dark blue. The reason being, we still want some vibrancy here, despite the fact that we've got plenty already. It's just to fit the color scheme a bit better. Despite being contrasting colors, we are going to paint the dark blue much the same as we painted the yellow, starting from a dark base coat and highlighting up lighter and lighter to the highlights. We do still want to keep it subtle, so we're going to keep the hues really close to each other and make sure it's real dark. The presence of a contrast color is very important, as it helps guide the eye over the more chaotic, brighter colors. It also gives the eye a bit of a chance to rest and something to just glide over that it doesn't really need to focus on. So it'll really help us out here. These pipes were more of the same. However, an added complication arrived in that there was some overspray I hadn't noticed until way too late. I could not undo far enough, so this was here to stay. I of course got around this by forcibly closing the program without saving, in hopes that I had made a save before the overspray happened. After repainting the pipes and being real careful about it, we can go into the little arm here that holds the wing. Thankfully, now that we've fixed the normals, it's a lot easier to paint, so there isn't much to talk about here. We just quickly come over here to this little chassis that holds the bomb flaps and highlight them according to the geometry. Nice and simple, so we can move on. This part here that holds the minigun in place took a surprisingly long time to do. I attribute that to the fact that I hadn't mirrored the object and couldn't do so now because it was too late. I didn't want to redo all the UV mapping I already did. Other than that, I had to avoid the crevices and highlight all around, so yeah, it took a while. That rounds us to this aiming part here. Thankfully, it just comprises of steps we've already done before. We can add a little bit of red though, just to give it a splash of color. It is at this point that I took a step back and finally admitted that this bright color just wasn't working. So I just had a look around and decided what to do about it. I tried adding a dark grey wash to all the metal parts, but it didn't really darken it enough to my liking. Then I tried darkening up the yellow, maybe with an orange or another yellow or anything really, but it just made it look more dull and I didn't like the look. I even tried putting a blue wash over the grey in an attempt to make it closer to the black that we've got, just to blend it in a bit. I wasn't happy with any of these solutions, and I was really starting to have doubts about how good this model was going to be. Maybe I'd even have to repaint all the metal parts because it just was not looking good. I actually found salvation in the form of the color ramp function in the material properties editor. It allowed me to change the color of something while keeping the texture. In short, it is exactly what I was looking for. After a bit of experimentation, I eventually landed on this red. I quite liked it, and it complemented the rest of the model quite well. Sure, it reduced the number of different colors that we had on the model, but to be honest, I much prefer it this way. I then proceeded to change every single bit of metal part into this red color. So, the lesson that I've learned today, and I hope you all as well, don't be afraid to change your mind, even if it is last minute, because sometimes you'll get something better out of it. For those curious, after tweaking some of the other colors around a bit, I also experimented with the yellow. I tried a variety of different colors, but the ones I liked the most was this black. But between the two, I preferred the yellow, so I stuck with my guns on this one. With that existential crisis averted, I hyped myself up by playing around a bit with the animation joints. All good shows start with a hook, something to get the viewer invested in so that they'll continue watching. In our case, I want to reveal some of the model but still keep it vague enough that the viewer wants to keep watching. For this purpose, I want a low angled shot with the vehicle flying overhead, banking, and then doing a 180. All we need to do is turn the vehicle and have it go forward simultaneously. We just need to think how this would react in reality, where as it's turning, its momentum would still carry it, so it wouldn't just do a immediate 180. Once we've got the movement down, and trust me, we'll fix the jank later, we need to make sure the camera can actually see what we're doing, as it's no use we animate something and then no one sees it. I'm also going to make the model spin, as the whole purpose is to show off a little bit. Now we've got all our big motions out of the way, we can get into the finer nitty-gritty and make this thing actually look good. We're going to begin by moving these little bodies around, with the goal of making it look more fluid and like it's reacting to the environment while flying through the air. The end result is something more akin to a bird or a fish going through the motions as opposed to an aeroplane. This will help us a lot sell the elven feel that we were trying to achieve from the beginning. To further aid this look, I turned all the hulls around in a realistic motion according to where it's turning, just to further emphasize the living creature part. It is at this point of the project that I foolishly felt good about myself. I thought we were all on track and everything was going smoothly. Unfortunately, I had selected something while in transparent mode and the program crashed, sending me all the way back to the beginning. We're going to have these flap things open slightly so that we can suggest those things being propelled by the glowy bits underneath. We also want to have some fun with our wings quick, before we get back to animating them realistically and making sure it actually looks like it's steering the vehicle through the air. This is of course something that aircraft in our real world will do, lending some legitimacy to our model. We're also going to make the flaps open wider during the climb, just to suggest it's drawing in extra power for the extra height. Now we're going to mimic a realistic stopping motion in the air, as we can't have the thing moving while our camera's spinning around it. This is quite easily done by having all the bodies move upwards in order to stop the motion, while extending all the flaps to cause a lot of air resistance. We're going to spin our barrels, because a minigun without rotary barrels is a sad thing indeed. We also need to animate the camera around so that it still has full view of the model as it's rotating, just so that nothing is missed. The goal here is to show off. So in an effort to do so, I'm going to show how articulated each of the flaps are by animating them individually. We also want the camera to be timed perfectly so that it can see what's happening as it's going past. Next up, we've got these flap things here. They're going to be housing the bombs, so as they open, the bombs are going to fly out. Not only does this look cool, but it also shows some function, as it'll be able to drop bombs behind it as it's flying overhead. This high yield idea will be achieved by parenting the bombs and putting them inside the hull. They will then fly out, rotate in a random direction, and fly off screen, as we don't really need to see them once they're out of our sight. What are wings made for, if not to flap? Even though that's not how this thing is going to fly, I really wanted to flap the wings because I thought it would look nice. So I did so during the spinning animation, and also to guide the thing as it's flying over the air a little bit. The last thing we need to do is position it in such a way that we can take a cheeky screenshot, and now it's on to the glamour shots. I'd like to thank you all for watching till the end. This video was slightly longer than normal, so I really appreciate it. This was the last model in this lineup, but I do have more videos coming out on this project, so stay tuned for that. See you next time.